Since around the 10th century CE, Lingchi was China's most cruel and unusual way of putting people to death. It was used for 1,000 years. The word Lingchi means slow slicing or death by 1,000 cuts. As the name suggests, it was a long and painful process in which people who had committed especially horrible crimes were put to death by being cut several times on the skin. The goal of most execution methods is to kill the person as soon as possible. The goal of Lingchi was to punish the offender slowly and for a long time so that they would suffer as much as possible. The Qing dynasty government made the practice illegal in 1905, but people still remember how horrible it was. What was Lingchi and how was it performed? The process of doing Lingchi was not overly complicated with any complications. It was mandated that those who carried out the executions should bind the condemned individual to a wooden post in such a way that they would be unable to move or escape their prison. Some accounts, like that of George Ernest Morrison, the author of the 1895 book An Australian in China, noted that the prisoner was dosed with opium prior to the execution. The prisoner is tied to a rude cross. He is invariably deeply under the influence of opium. The executioner, standing before him with a sharp sword, makes 2 quick incisions above the eyebrows and draws down the portion of skin over each eye. Then he makes 2 more quick incisions across the breast, and in the next moment he pierces the heart, and death is instantaneous. Then he cuts the body in pieces, and the degradation consists in the fragmentary shape in which the prisoner has to appear in heaven. As was described above, the executioner would make incisions to the flesh that was exposed, typically beginning at the chest. The breast and the muscles that surrounded it would be removed in a methodical manner until the ribs were almost visible. The executioner would then proceed to move down to the thighs, where he would repeat the operation. After that, he would move to the arms, where he would cut away significant amounts of skin and expose muscle tissue in a carnage that would be excruciating. At this moment, it is most likely that the victim had already passed away. Next, the individuals carrying out the execution would gather the severed limbs and place them in a basket. The act of Lingchi had a tendency to differ from place to region due to the fact that Chinese law did not designate any particular method of delivery. According to some stories, the individuals who were sentenced were executed in a span of less than 15 minutes, whilst other cases reportedly lasted over many hours and required the accused to endure up to 3,000 cuts. All of these particulars would be determined by the depth of each incision, as well as the amount of expertise of the person carrying out the execution and the gravity of the offense. According to reports, officials would occasionally show compassion for individuals who were charged with less serious infractions, thereby reducing the amount of time they were forced to endure agony. It was common for families who had the financial means to pay for the immediate execution of their sentenced relatives. This would ensure that the initial cut would be the final one, and it would also spare them the possibility of being subjected to hours of painful torture. Who fell victim to the brutal execution method? Due to the fact that Lingchi was only used for the most heinous crimes, such as treason, mass murder, patricide, and matricide, not everyone was subject to death in such a terrible and unusual manner. Through the use of Lingchi, a guy was found guilty of raping 182 women and sentenced to death. Additionally, in the year 1542, 16 palace maids were supposedly sentenced to the cruel death penalty for their involvement in an attempt to kill the emperor. An additional Lingchi record from the 16th century describes the passing of Liu Jin, a eunuch who worked for the Zhengde emperor. Because he had taken an excessive amount of power from the sovereign, he was put to death in the year 1510. It is said that he endured more than 3,000 incisions over the course of 2 days prior to his death. It is also said that the people of Beijing paid for parts of his flesh and consumed them with rice wine. In his 1895 book, The Peoples and Politics of the Far East, English journalist and Parliament member Sir Henry Norman published a snippet from a Chinese newspaper that described one woman's Lingchi sentence. Ma Peiyao, governor of Guangxi, reports a triple poisoning case in his province. A woman, having been beaten by her husband on account of her slovenly habits, took counsel with an old herb woman, and by her direction picked some poisonous herb on the mountain, with which she successively poisoned her husband, father-in-law, and brother-in-law. She has been executed by the slow process. Even though many ancient reports of Lingchi were probably mythologized in order to fit a sensationalized Western narrative that depicted the savage customs of the then mysterious Chinese populace, there was one example that offered photographic evidence of such cruelty. The Lingchi execution of Fu Zhuli was captured on video by French travelers who were in the area. After being found guilty of the murder of his lord, a Mongolian prince, in 1905, he was the last person to be executed by Lingchi. This occurred just a few weeks before the Chinese government prohibited the practice of death by 1,000 cuts the following year. The abolishment of Lingchi as a method of punishment. The practice of Lingchi was controversial from the very beginning. As early as the 12th century, Chinese citizens were speaking out against it. The poet and historian Lu Yu wrote a letter to the imperial court of the Song dynasty arguing, "When the muscles of the flesh are already taken away, the breath of life is not yet cut off. Liver and heart are still connected, seeing and hearing still exist. It affects the harmony of nature, it is injurious to a benevolent government, and does not befit a generation of wise men." For individuals who were subjected to Lingchi, the anguish of the practice stemmed not only from the painful act itself, but also from the meaning that it held for them. Altering the body of a victim meant that they would not be whole in the afterlife, which was in accordance with the Confucian ideal of filial piety, which can be translated as loyalty to one's biological family. Consequently, the act constituted a form of public humiliation as well as a death sentence, both in a literal sense and in a spiritual one both. That explains why torture was only reserved for the most egregious or defiant actions in the past. Lingchi, on the other hand, has been practiced for at least 1,000 years, despite the controversy that has surrounded it. There are a number of purported stories of the punishment occurring throughout the early 20th century, despite the fact that it was formally prohibited in the year 1905. The guy who was considered to be responsible for Yang Zengxin's killing in 1928 was supposedly punished by Lingchi. However, he was forced to watch his daughter die first. Yang Zengxin was the governor of Xinjiang at the time of his death. Furthermore, in the year 1936, it was stated that a leader of a communist revolt was executed by means of the brutal manner. Nevertheless, it is said that there were no official punishments of Lingchi handed out after the year 1905. In spite of the fact that it is not known when the last Lingchi execution took place, the gruesome tradition has been out of favor for the past century. However, the deed was so horrifying that it will not be forgotten in the near future.
We hope you liked this video. Watch another video here,